Good morning and welcome all to this webinar from wherever you are. Would love to know where you're joining us from. So please type in the Q&A box which country you're from, which county you're from. Would love to know where you're joining us from. This is the first webinar of the year and we are feeling very privileged to have you. And we're training our focus on the developments in cage-free egg production in Africa, just as you'll come to learn in this webinar. And leading us in this discussion is Dr. Victor Yamo. He is the Farming Campaigns Manager at World Animal Protection, where he's actively engaging the livestock industry, governments, corporates, technical personnel, consumers, and the general public in showing the critical connection between the welfare of farm animals, their productivity, and the quality and safety of food they produce, which ultimately lands on your plate. This conversation is global, and we are uh, going to run it through the Animals Matter AF hashtag, just as it's been shown on the previous screen. And our Twitter handle is at Move the World AF, just as you've seen in the previous social media screen. Before we kick off, we'll pop up 3 poll questions just to gauge your understanding on farming systems. So this will be up for about 1 minute. So kindly ensure to select your answers quickly. The results will be shared at the end of Victor's presentation. So we'll be curious to find out what you get to answer. We'll also have a Q&A session after the presentation so that you are able to get clarification on anything Victor might have talked about and you did not understand. So during the webinar, kindly put in your questions in the Q&A box. If you're a journalist representing any media house, kindly stick around. After this main session with everyone, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes with you where you can get to verbally ask your questions to Victor to help you further with your media work in the course of the day. I'm just checking the Q&A box. It's interesting. We can see we have South Africa in the house. We have Kenya, Nairobi. We have Uganda. We have Ghana. We have Tanzania. We have Nigeria. We have wow, it's quite overwhelming. We have more South Africa. Thank you so much, South Africa, for joining us. We have Sudan. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you find this webinar very engaging, and please don't shy away from asking any questions in the Q&A box. We'll do our best to ensure we answer you. Over to the poll where you get to share with us your understanding of farming systems. Thank you. Over to you, Victor. We'll be sharing the results after his presentation. Thank you.
Those who have joined us, I will quickly run you through a short presentation that highlights various aspects of egg cage production systems. I hope you'll be able to carry along. If there's any questions, as Beth has said, kindly inbox her or allow us to have them at the end of this presentation. So the presentation is entitled, It's Time to Go to Cage-Free Production Systems. And I think the best place to start is to look at global statistics so that we understand why we produce eggs. Essentially, Africa's population is about 1.21 billion against a total global population of about 7.3 billion, which is about 16%. It's estimated that in another 35 years, we'll be looking at about 2.4 billion Africans, which would be about 25% of the global population. And essentially then we need to find out how we are going to feed that population using the various resources that we have, and especially relating to animals. And just to give you a snapshot of the current consumption, we consume about 280 billion kilograms of meat, 223 billion liters of milk and about 1 trillion eggs annually. And so that's part of what we are looking at as we go forward. I think it's important to understand that protein is becoming a growing part of people's diet, especially in the African continent. As people get slightly more money, they tend to then look at proteins, and especially animal proteins. And eggs are the fastest growing proteins consumed worldwide, with about 50% growth forecast over the next 2 decades as we go along. Most egg production is in the developing countries, and Africa produces about 2.3 million tons of eggs per year, which is about 3.7 to 4.4% of the global egg production. In terms of consumption, Africa consumes about 36 eggs per person per year, compared to the global average of about 145 eggs per person per year. So essentially what we are saying is that Africa is not consuming enough eggs, and there's room for improvement. And I think industry is working towards that to ensure that we consume adequate eggs. Briefly, to just then look at the poultry industry, the poultry meat industry caters for about $16 billion US, and is expected to grow about between 8 to 10% per year, while the egg industry caters for about $9 billion US. The trends that are driving this in the African context is the fact that we are looking at a growing urban population. We have an expanding middle class, and there's a shift from vegetable-based to protein consumption to more of meats and animal products. And there's also an expanding retail, quick service restaurants, and home delivery services. And I think as we have handled Corona, a lot of things have moved into home delivery. People can buy food online from fast food restaurants. But the challenge we are having in the African context is the fact that we also have an underdeveloped value chain that is adapting to the changing situation in terms of production and in terms of retail and restaurants. Having finished that initial introduction to just give you a snapshot of what is happening in the African context, I think the best place to start then is for us to understand what animal welfare is, and then move progressively into egg production systems, and then end up in what is actually happening globally, and especially with special interest on what is happening in the African context. So animal welfare is defined as the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the conditions in which it lives and ultimately dies. And that is the definition, the technical definition provided by the World Organization for Animal Health. So animals are said to be in good state of welfare if they're healthy, they're comfortable, they're well-nourished, they're safe, and they're able to express their innate behavior or their natural behavior, and they are not suffering from unpleasant states of pain, fear, distress, and stress. And essentially this is underpinned by what is known as the 5 animal freedoms. And the 5 animal freedoms are basically freedom from hunger and thirst, which is essentially looking at what you're feeding animals to ensure that it's feed that meets the animals' nutritional or physiological requirements in their production stage, and also to ensure that they have water. And I think that is one of the things that we miss, water, and adequate water, clean, wholesome water, that is important. The second thing is freedom from discomfort, which is about the environment in which the animal is living. And essentially what you're saying is that we need to ensure that the animal is in a comfortable environment, well ventilated, the litter is dry, and they're not having any challenges. And that is part of what we'll be looking at later in the slides. There's freedom from pain, injury, and disease. Whatever system they're in should not be predisposing the animal to pain or to injury or to disease conditions. And that's why we look at things like housing. We ensure that there's good biosecurity. We ensure that the animals are vaccinated and disease control is managed. The number 4 animal freedom is about freedom to express normal behavior. Animals should be able to express their animalness. They should be able to, if it's birds, if you're looking at their birds, for instance, today, they should be able to perch, they should be able to flap their wings, they should be able to scratch, they should be able to explore the environment they're in, and they should be able to exercise and move around. And finally, freedom from fear and distress, which is about ensuring that the mental well-being of the animal is catered for. So question then we asked ourselves, what then is the importance of animal welfare? And essentially animal welfare firstly is important for the animal because animals are sentient beings, which is just to say that animals feel, they experience, and they suffer. And they're able to remember what they've gone through. And so whatever system that we're using to produce animals must ensure and recognize the sentience of that animal and provide for it to ensure that the animal is able to have positive experiences in that production systems. But animal welfare is also important for humans, and especially around productivity and food quality. It has been shown in research that good welfare leads to better production, increased productivity of the animals, good quality foods, which then addresses things like food security, food safety, and ensuring that the farmer also ends up with a good livelihood of returns from their investment. But animal welfare is also becoming important and critical in terms of being a necessity for business efficiency and profitability. International trade is now looking at how animals are transported, the welfare of that animal to ensure that the animal is catered for and that the production system that is not negatively impacting on the animal as we do that. And around that, to just show the criticalness of business, we have something known as Business Benchmark for Farm Animal Welfare, which is a global ranking of world's leading food companies. And food companies here include restaurants, include retailers, include producers. And the critical driving word is global public ranking. And essentially, we look at the publicly available information on companies' websites, especially around welfare policies, around practices and performance. And the benchmark provides an annual review of how the major companies are actually reporting and managing farm animal welfare. And also, it's being used to recognize food companies that are making animal welfare a critical component of their business. The benchmark then looks at 7 key animal welfare related areas, especially for farm animals. One being close confinement, which is what we will concentrate on today. There's use of antibiotics prophylactically, there's use of growth promoting substances, there's use of genetically modified or cloned animals, routine mutilations, which is about teeth clipping, the baking of birds, etc., and then looking at pre-slaughter stunning and transportation during the production system. And as I've said, today we will concentrate predominantly on confinement because that is what cage production is all about. But to then narrow down into that, I would like to just give highlights of the 2019 report. There's a 2020 report that will be launched later in March, but this then gives us opportunities to begin understanding what is happening in the food system and beginning to show how organizations are beginning to address farm animal welfare with emphasis on cage production systems. The last report looked at 150 global food companies, and essentially these are the leading 150 global food companies. They included 52 retailers, 63 producers, and 35 restaurants. 130 of them, which is about 87% of them, acknowledge that farm animal welfare is a critical business issue, and 69% of that group had established farm animal welfare policies. These policies apply across all geographies. So if an organization is, say, from Europe, but having branches or franchises in Africa, then the policy would cut across. In 77% of the organizations, the policies cut across all animal species. It was across, if it's a cage production system, it looked at the aspects of confinement in pigs, in chickens, in dairy cows, etc. And then policies also applied across all products that are produced or sold by the organization. And I think this will become clearer as we look at the later half of this presentation. The other highlight that came out of that report is the fact that 87% of the companies have acknowledged that farm animal welfare is a relevant business issue, and 68% of them are actually now working in partnership with other organizations and stakeholders to advance farm animal welfare. In terms of close confinement, about 78% of the companies that were looked at had some level of policies around confinement. Those policies could have been partial, could have been partial without scope, could have been universal, but the fact is that 78% of the companies have policies around close confinement. Just to compare with antibiotic use, which is the other big thing, you find that about almost close to about 70% of the companies, again, have policies around antibiotics use that are critical and important. And just to highlight over how the trends have been over the last 5 or so years, you can see that close confinement is the biggest thing that organizations are looking at, with almost between 72 and 79% of the organizations having policies, internal farm animal welfare policies that address close confinement. And close confinement is critical to understand is not only about layer cage production systems, but it's also about sow stalls. It's also about looking at stocking densities in broiler production systems. But today we will concentrate on layer cage systems as we go along. The important thing is that close confinement compromises animal welfare, the 5 fundamentals that we've looked at, leading to predisposing the animals to stress that leads to disease and ultimately leads to antibiotic use. And that's the reason why in this presentation we've then touched a bit on antibiotics. The report also highlights the fact that there's growing attention around farm animal welfare because of being driven by certain things. One is the fact that regulatory requirements of animal welfare, food safety, and quality is beginning to look at critically how animals are treated, because we have now seen that there's a connection between animal welfare and in production systems and ultimately food safety and quality of that food that ends onto your table. The second thing is that investors are also beginning to get concerned because they do not want to invest in systems that are not sustainable and are not going to be, that are not going to last for a while. The other thing that is critical and important is that consumers are also interacting, showing interest in food quality, food safety, and traceability. And that is important because consumers are now beginning to use their monies to decide what is going to be put on the table and where they purchase their products from. Hence the reason why in the webinar, we are also looking at how do we then engage the retail sector that is providing some of these things, and how then does that work into the whole cage systems. The big thing, and one of the other big things that is becoming very important, is the fact that it's something that we've decided to call food scandals. And food scandals, simply put, is what we see coming out through media. And that is why we have a level of media engagement even in this webinar, because we see headlines like some of which I've put there. What did the chicken on your plate eat? Beware, it could be fatal. Watch out, you could be consuming antibiotics in meat. Food on sale is filthy and contains poisons. These are headlines that show that there's a problem in the production system. But the question we need to ask ourselves, where is the problem coming from? And what do we need as Africans to do to address this problem and ensure that our food is safe and our food is not bringing anything that will negatively impact on us? Having looked at animal welfare, I think the next important thing to look at then to get all of us onto the same space is then to look at egg production systems. Essentially, globally, there are 3 egg production systems that are recognized. One is the free range, which involves rearing animals or chickens in wide open spaces where they live in nature or are housed with access to natural spaces, eating natural foods and soaking normal sunlight. And these are critical things because the level of nutrients in the eggs, for instance, depends on certain vitamins and exposure to sunlight at certain levels. The second production system is what we call deep litter system, or production in barns, where animals are housed in large barns, but they're left to move around freely on the floor. They're able to scratch, they're able to scratch the bedding material, they're able to explore, they're able to flap their wings, they're able to, in cases where the environment is not barren, they're even able to patch. And that is something that is slowly where Africa is heading to, production system that is in big barns. The third system is what we are looking at today, which is the battery cage system, where animals are housed in small battery cages that are connected together in rows, as is shown on that diagram. And essentially, each cage has 3 to 5 birds, depending on the size of the birds. And these birds spend the rest of their lives in that space. Essentially, what you're saying is that the animal then has very limited space. It's not able to move, it's not able to express its innate natural behavior, and that then brings challenges, and that is something that we are beginning to ask, that we have that conversation around, and that's why we are sensitizing you, the general public, and technical people, to then say what is in it for us, and does this system work, and what are the alternatives that we need to be looking at. To then appreciate what happens, naturally, birds have certain behaviors that we need to take cognizance in. Birds are supposed to be able to dust bathe, which is essentially a mechanism that helps them to lose the heat. And essentially, the photograph that we put there is of a bird that is actually dust bathing, the bird that is in the middle, flapping its wings and throwing the litter up in the air. Birds are also supposed to be able to nest, especially for layer birds. They need to search for adequate place to lay their eggs. And then birds are also supposed to forage, which is a behavior around which there is scratch to try and look for food. And then birds are also supposed to be able to perch. And for comfort behavior, they're also supposed to be able to do wing flapping, to raise their wings, and to stretch their wings. These are all critical and important, and they all work towards ensuring that the bird has a very positive experience in the production system, which then leads to improved productivity and good quality products coming out of that system. When we talk about battery cage systems, I know that farmers will talk about advantages, and there are several advantages, and it's something that as an organization we recognize. And I think those of us who are pushing for better production system are not saying that the cage system is bad, we're just saying that it has certain advantages, but also has certain limitations, and we need to then weigh what works and how we are then going to push this discussion forward. Some of the advantages of cage system, when you talk to layer farmers, they say it's easy to manage because the birds are in a cage, the eggs roll out of the cage, and they're easy to collect. You don't need a lot of labor if you compare to things like free range or to deep litter production system. They also say that it has increased hygiene with low incidence of disease. However, practically in the African system, what you're seeing is that because of poor management and poor welfare, and the farmer not having a comfortable environment, we still end up with a lot of respiratory problems in production systems because of the massive number of layers that we're then putting in a very limited space. The other advantage is that the animals are in small groups because you're having 2 to 3, so there's low social friction, there's going to be less pecking, but the birds are also in a cage where they have, they're permanently on a wire floor, and that leads to some challenges with their foots, and you have lameness. The absence of litter problems, again, because the birds are in cage systems, and the droppings drop directly onto the floor and they can be removed easily. That then contributes to what farmers believe is better working conditions and, at certain levels, low cost of production. On the downside, the disadvantages of the cage production system includes lack of physical and psychological space for the hens, which essentially means the animal is not able to exercise. And science has shown that because of lack of exercise and because of the demands of production, the animal ends up with a lot of calcium being drawn out of its systems, out of its skeletal system, and we end up with animals that are going to easily have fractures, and especially when they're moved around when being depleted, you end up with a lot of broken legs, which then is not good for the animal. The animals also, as I said earlier on, lacks opportunity for nesting, which leads to frustrations and ultimately leads to a drop in production because the animal cannot find a comfortable nesting opportunity. There is also a lack of opportunities to express its natural behavior, the ones that we've looked up there. And all these things add up to a situation where the bird is a bit frustrated, and that then depresses production or brings stress, which ultimately leads to disease conditions because of poor immune systems. So what is the future of battery cage systems? Globally, we've seen that battery cage systems have been banned or phased out in the European Union way back in 2012. And progressively it's being done in UK, Canada, US, and New Zealand. If you take the US, for instance, in Michigan State in 2019, they started a 5-year phased out process of moving out of battery cage system. In the African production systems, we've seen a move from indigenous production system, which was more free range and backyard, into intensive farming systems because of the reasons we alluded to earlier on, increasing urban population and increasing middle class, and all these things having demands in production and the supply of animal products and animal proteins. Because of this, we've seen what was burnt in certain areas, equipment that were burnt in certain areas being brought into the African context. And in certain cases, it's even been brought with credit so that farmers are able to get credit to buy certain production systems like battery cage systems. Unfortunately, not looking at the impact and the reason why they were burnt in certain places. Certain countries like the South African Poultry Association have tried to then sensitize people to understand the cage-free revolution and how the industry is going to impact on the African industry and production systems. This has led to situations where there are coalitions that have come together to start looking at how do we then manage production systems and how, especially around cage and cage production systems. And we have things like coalitions like the Open Wing Alliance that is now looking at some of these things and driving that process by raising consumer awareness, especially around food safety and food quality, and especially also around the aesthetic look of the production system and the impact it has on the animal itself. And this is then driving people making buying decisions around some of these things. If you look at, for instance, if you look at what consumers are looking at, we can see from literature that consumers are beginning to demand cage-free eggs because of what they are seeing in terms of battery cage system, the poor system, its impact on on the birds itself. We're also seeing in the Kenyan situation, consumer willingness to even pay for higher welfare production systems. And I think if you go to the market, you see what happens. People tend to go for free-range eggs, which then attract a premium compared to the normal layer. And I think that is something that industry needs to understand and see how that consumer behavior is then driving demand for cage-free eggs. As an organization, some time back, a year or so back, we looked at, we did a CAP survey, knowledge, attitude, and practice survey across 4 African countries. And some of the interesting things that came up is that people are beginning to look at the production system and how welfare friendly it is. And in the survey, you could see averagely about 48.3% of the people said they would purchase more if the production system was animal welfare friendly. And you can see the individual for each of the countries that the survey was done in. People also beginning to connect food safety to how the animal is being raised. And 82.7% of the population then talked about they would purchase more food, especially around production system, animal production system, if food safety was assured. And I think that is something that we need to start looking at, even as we look at production systems, the connection between the welfare of that animal and the safety of that food that ultimately comes from that production system. People are also saying they would prefer to look at organic or free-range production system, and 55.3% of the polled respondents said that they would purchase more if they were sure that the animal or the product was from an organic or free-range. I think that therein lies a challenge that Africa needs to then start looking at. How do we start classifying or start producing, labeling our production so that it's not just lumped as eggs, but you can then say these are eggs from a free-range system, these are eggs from normal commercial egg production system, these are organic eggs. And I also think at that level, we also need to then define what is organic, what is free-range, and therein the government then needs to create certain standards around what is organic, what's free-range, what's commercial, etc., etc. In conclusion now, as we move into the cage-free commitments, we need to look at what commitments are organizations making and what commitments are we seeing through the production system and what is driving these commitments. And as consumers, what then do we need to do? And as producers, what then do we need to do to ensure that we are exactly where the rest of the world is so that Africa is not being left behind in terms of some of these commitments? What I want to do to then highlight this is to look at some of the brands that are in Africa and what they are saying around cage production. I know this is an emotive subject. When we even sent out the posters, there was quick feedback that maybe it's something that we need not to be discussing. But I want us to look at it in the light of what is happening in industry and what are we seeing. And then as Africans or as producers or as value chain players in this industry, make certain decisions on how we are going to progress this forward. In the BBFAO for 2019, one of the big brands that we looked at was Carrefour, which is a big French supermarket that is moving into Africa. And I think it's already in Kenya, Egypt, a bit in Uganda, and it's still growing on the continent. Carrefour was placed in Tier 4 in 2018 and 2019, which means it has animal welfare policies that it is implementing. The interesting thing is that Carrefour is then doing two things that we need to be very clear about. One, they're collaborating with a laboratory to look at animal welfare around abattoirs and the use of antibiotics. And it's something that is very important, especially when you're looking at safety of food and use and misuse of antibiotics leading to antimicrobial resistance. They're also in partnership with Humane Society, looking at cage-free production systems. And as is already shown in this slide, we can see what their commitments around abattoirs and what they want to do about abattoirs. But the more interesting one, which ties to today's discussion, is in 2017, Carrefour became the first retailer to ensure that all Carrefour branded eggs in Europe were produced by using cage-free production system. And the target is to have this by 2025, that everything that will be getting, any egg that will be going into their system in Europe should be cage-free by 2025. Carrefour has also started collaborating with farmers and suppliers with a target that by 2025, this cage beef production system will be not only in Europe, but it's also be cutting across various other geographies. And remember, when we talked about BBFA, we looked at policies that cut across geographies, and that was very important. So for instance, Carrefour has said that by 2025, they will stop the sale of eggs that are from cage-free production systems in Europe. Similarly, a similar commitment has been made by Carrefour in Taiwan, which is the first supermarket in Asia to commit to cage-free egg production systems. And similarly, last year in 2018, Carrefour became Brazil's leading food retailer, which committed to selling cage-free eggs. A similar situation, if we are just going to conclude on Carrefour, a similar situation is being looked at in the African context. I know that there's already engagement between Carrefour and some of the animal welfare organizations to look at cage-free production systems. And as early as last month, Carrefour was having a meeting with their suppliers to ensure that they start the process of ensuring that Africa is not left behind. Other organizations that have made commitments around cage-free production system includes Nestle, that is transitioning to cage-free egg supply chains in Africa by 2025. They started with Europe by 2020, and now the target is to have Europe, Africa, Latin America, Oceania, and Middle East on the same process by 2025. Similarly, Radisson Hotels is also doing the same thing, committing to sourcing cage-free egg production from cage-free egg production system by 2025. And again, you realize Nestle, Radisson, Carrefour are all on the African continent, and something that we need to then be alive to, that our retailers are moving towards a certain process, and producers and the players in the industry need to then determine how we are going to work towards that. McDonald's in South Africa also committed to source cage-free eggs by 2025. And again, you can see another of the big brands on the continent, global brand on the continent, is making the same commitments. So as I was saying, Carrefour, Unilever, Radisson are some of the brands that have made certain commitments to ensure that we are moving towards the cage-free production system. And I think as producers, the critical thing that we need to look at is what do we do with this information, and how then do we respond to it to ensure that we are able to drive that process going forward. I think the first thing that is critical is to recognize that the critical role that farm animal welfare is playing in business. And I think that is something that companies and organizations are beginning to understand. And I think it's for our role as organizations or as consumers is then to see how do we then work to ensure that animal welfare is catered for in the production system. And that's why, as an organization, we drive corporate commitments through the value chain. We work with producers, we work with suppliers, we work with the retailers, we work with the restaurants to ensure that people then are able to drive high welfare production systems and change the concept that chickens or farm animals are not sentient beings. The second thing is for industry to appreciate that consumers are beginning to have certain demands and quickly determine how we are going to address these demands. As already shown, consumers in Africa are behaving exactly like consumers elsewhere in the world from various surveys that we've done. And I think it's being driven by the fact that we are in a global village. And so consumers are able to see what is happening elsewhere and beginning to demand that certain standards are met in their production system. And as shown on that slide on your right is an example of a pledge or something that is driving a petition to drive some of these things. Finally, it's also important to appreciate the fact that the impact of international brands coming into Africa. When you have big brands like McDonald's, like Unilever, like Carrefour coming into the African market, what then do we need to do to ensure that there are global processes or global policies that cut across all the markets that are are met? If we do not do that, I think the challenge for us in the African setting is that we'll then end up exposing ourselves to potential imports of products from elsewhere because our production system is not meeting the requirements of the big brands that are settling into these countries. With those few remarks, I think that is the last slide, and I want to say thank you and open up for questions and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victor, for that very well detailed presentation. I have personally learned a lot, though I work with you. So it's my hope that everyone else who is joining us from different parts of Africa has gotten to learn quite a bit. Before we go to the Q&A, I'd like to share the poll results from the first poll we did at the beginning of the webinar. So 68% of you say that you actually know what battery cage farming is. We have 59% of you who say that you're not sure where your chicken comes from. So you walk into a restaurant, you walk into a hotel, you eat chicken, but you're not sure where it comes from. And 75% of you say that you get your meat from local butcheries. So thank you so much for letting us know that. Any comments, Victor, on what we have just received from the attendees in terms of the poll results?
I was saying that it is interesting that almost 70% of the respondents or people who have responded to your survey are not clear where their food is coming from. And for me, a good customer or consumer needs to understand that the source of that food is critical. If the source has problems, then where is our recourse? Where do we go back to? So my encouragement to the participants, it would be nice to start engaging your retailer, engaging your butchery, and engaging your supplier so that you understand the processes that they undergo to get the food to your table. If it's eggs, where are they sourcing them from? Is it a free-range system? Is it a battery cage system? If it's battery cage system, does it give you a better quality product? Does it give you a lesser quality product? These are things that I think consumers need to start looking at. And I think that's why, the reasons why as an organization, we engage consumers, because when consumers know the questions to ask, then they drive the welfare of farm animals within the value chain. And that then ensures that the animal enjoys a relatively good life during its production period. Thank you, Beth. I hope it's clearer now.
Francis has asked, how can farmers ensure that their poultry are free from diseases? Because most of them say that they use battery cage systems to prevent these animals from loitering around and collecting diseases. And then you have spoken about corporates and how they are giving commitments in terms of going cage free. Where is the government's place in this whole discussion? Because the way corporates operate means that they need goodwill from governments. And then the other question is, what does the introduction of cage farming in the African context mean for trade when it comes to poultry farmers? Are they able to compete internationally? What does that mean? These shifts in the corporate market and a lot more farmers in the African market onboarding into cage farming.
Thank you, Beth, for those questions. I might have missed the first one, but I think I got the gist, because I'm assuming somebody was asking about how to ensure that animals that are free-range are not getting a disease. And I know it's something that farmers talk about, that the reason why they use battery cage system is the animal is enclosed, they are not getting in contact with the outside world, so you minimize disease. But I think essentially what we need to look at is the biosecurity systems. In any production system, you must have a biosecurity and hygiene and sanitation system, which essentially then looks at disease control and disease management. That is a whole webinar by itself. But in a nutshell, what you're saying is, in any production system, the animals should be relatively enclosed, like we talked about free range, where the animals have a house, but they have access to outside. In that outside environment, you then ensure that the animal has minimum contact with disease-causing organisms by looking at things like rats or rodents or birds that could get in touch and contaminate the environment. The biggest challenge, I think, from my experience, is actually humans. Me and you, when you go visiting these farms, do we change our clothes? Do we shower into these facilities? Do we observe the biosecurity protocols? That is very critical. The next level is also to ensure that you have in place a good vaccination schedule, because animals, or like humans, need to be vaccinated. So even if they might get disease, if they were vaccinated and vaccinated well, then you minimize disease transmission. But essentially what you're saying is that there's also a myth that cage system then minimizes disease. As I alluded to earlier on, that's not necessarily so. If you have poor biosecurity systems, where in the same cage production system there's rats or rodents because of poor management of feed, and you also have wild birds getting into that house, you'll still end up with disease issues. And remember that in the cage situation, you are even the bird is at a disadvantage, because it is already having stress. It is in an enclosed space. It is being stressed by the minimal space it has. It cannot exhibit its natural behavior. So ultimately, that stress leads to a poor immune system that then predisposes the animal to disease. So the disease debate is both ends. There are challenges in battery cage systems that we need to look at. There are challenges in the other system, but holistically, then what we need to look at is any good farmer must have a good disease control biosecurity protocol that then manages the whole system. I hope that clarifies that. The second one, the question around where is government placed in this discussion? Government's role is providing regulations or legislation or policies or standards. globally, there are already certain standards that have been generated around production system. If you look at the OIE, World Organization for Animal Health, there's already a standard or a policy around layer production systems and what needs to be in that system and what we need to be looking at around those systems. We recently did the African strategy for animal welfare, which also speaks to some of these things. So government needs to then ensure that the farmers or the producers or the value chain have proper standards that are benchmarked into international standards. And as we said earlier on, animal welfare is becoming a critical prerequisite for business. And so if you're looking at going to do business, part of it is that government needs to provide the relevant enabling legislation. So if you look at the Kenyan situation, for instance, we are now looking at developing an animal welfare and protection bill that is going through the system. That bill will talk about farm animal welfare, what needs to be in terms of confinement, what spacing do you give animals, how do you feed those animals, and those are critical things that industry drives, but also closely monitored by government. And that's a critical role that government needs to look at. The last question is about what does the introduction of cage farming into Africa look like? And how then does it impact on business, if I got the gist of that question? I alluded to the fact that the cage system is already burnt elsewhere. And what we are seeing is that cage system is then being sold to Africa as a means or a system that Africa can adopt. The challenge we are having is that while that is being done, the big high-value markets, the big supermarkets that we are looking at, the big fast food restaurants, the McDonald's of this world, the Carrefours of this world, are already telling us that they're making commitments that by 2025, they will not be purchasing from a cage production system. So what are then the dilemma we are having in Africa then is we are having a production system that the rest of the world is rejecting, which by 2025, which is barely 2-3 years down the line, will not be getting us into those high value markets. So what we are then saying is that we are going to be producing for the lower end of the market and not for the high end of the market. And remember that once the high end of the market is not able to get the products that they want because of their global processes, it simply means that we will end up with a net importation of certain products into our markets, be it eggs because of cage production systems. If Kenya, for instance, cannot produce enough eggs to go into cage-free eggs to go into the high-value market, it means that somebody will get permits to then bring that egg here because our policy, our production system does not meet the requirements of their retail systems. And I think that is the debate and the discussion we need to be having. I think for far too long as Africans, what we've done is to bury our heads and look at it from a simplistic view and say that we don't have enough eggs, so and even enough space, so we don't need to take cognizance of what's happening. I think the important thing is to say the high international markets coming into our backyards, they have certain requirements and they're making certain commitments. Our question then is, are producers ready to meet that requirement? If they are not, then unfortunately it means that niche of that market will be supplied from elsewhere, which means we'll be exporting our jobs because eggs will be coming from a different source. I hope that's clear, and back to you, Beth, for other questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Victor, for that detail. Another set of questions is in regards to labeling. You have mentioned that corporates are making commitments in regards to cage-free. Does that also include the labeling of products that are cage-free? Some of the attendees here are talking about people, labeling products wrongly to be able to make a killing from it. So really, how can consumers be able to tell which is which? And also with the corporates, are they making any plans to do proper labeling of some of these products that are considered organic, cage-free, and whatnot? Then the other question is in regards to data. What is the futuristic data in terms of consumption? Are we moving towards more people consuming meat products, and what is that likely to mean for animal welfare standards? And then the other question is, for farmers who have already onboarded into battery cage farming, what does transition look like if they would want to come out from battery cage farming to go into free range farming, which is more ideal? And the last question is in regards to holistic animal welfare. We live in a context where battery cage systems are coming into the market, but we also have in other animal welfare challenges. For example, once these animals are reared, they are taken to my apologies for that. They are taken into the market in certain transport systems which are not animal welfare friendly. What are organizations like World Animal Protection doing to empower people like enforcers, so that they know certain ways of transporting animals is not humane, and therefore people who are doing inhumane transportation should be locked up, or whatever else is considered a legal process?
The reality is that we have not reached a stage where we are able to effectively label, and that's why we have challenges with what is out there. If you go to the market today, you will see free, quote unquote, free range eggs, you will see commercial eggs, you will see all manner of things in the market. And that's why I alluded to the fact that labeling is something that should be, it's a certification process that needs to be driven by government. And if you remember in my presentation, I talked about we need first as Africa to define what is organic, what is free range, what is the commercial eggs, and then classify them. I know in certain organizations or certain brands are beginning to start having that discussion to have their own labels. But I think it's something that needs to be done centrally, driven by government, but in collaboration with the industry, the poultry industry, so that we are clear. If I went to Uganda and collected what is called an organic egg or an organic chicken, what is it the same thing that I would be eating if I was in Zambia or in South Africa? I think there's a discussion that needs to happen around that. And I think the structure is there. There are things like the codex, there are things like the Bureau of Standards. It's just that we need to then come together and agree on what we are trying to do and what each label would look like. Internationally, there are labels that are already being used from elsewhere, and I think certain African brands have even been engaging some of those things, like the red tractor in Britain, to try and then look at some of these things. So something, I think it's a challenge for us as industry locally to start developing relevant standards and relevant labels that then drive some of this process. In terms of data, I think it's good to ask where are we going to? And I alluded to it earlier on when I said that we have an urban population that is growing. We have a middle class that is growing. And so essentially for Africa in the next couple of years, we'll be looking at increased consumption. And if you remember what I said, we are looking at eating 36 eggs per person per year compared to the global average, which is about 145 eggs per person per year. That is something that we need to be looking at, and that is what is driving intensification in the African context. I think for us as producers or as industry, the important thing that we need to do is how do we then come together to ensure that we do not make the same mistakes that the developing world did. We do not go into intensive farming system that ends up being so negative that negatively then impacts on the whole system. And I think we can learn from what they've done. We can then be asking ourselves questions. Why is it that they are banning cage production systems in Europe? Why is it that they are banning cage production system in North America? Why is it that the stocking density for chickens is being reduced? Yeah? Africa is moving towards that side, but the rest of the world is going back to where Africa is. That's the discussion, and I think if at the end of this webinar we can pick that discussion, that's a critical thing. Then as policy producers and industry, how then do we bring this to this discussion into the table? Because remember that food systems must also be sustainable. They must not be impacting other things negatively. If the food system is already causing challenges because it's impacting on Arab natural resources, the land that you're going to use, that's something that we need to look at. And I think our challenge is we've been looking at these things in isolation and forgetting that even producing eggs is done on some land which is in a certain environment. How do we ensure that that environment is maintained sustainably? Those are the thoughts that I think we wanted to provoke so that those discussions are then had. For the farmers that have already gone into cage production systems, I think the reason why industries are making commitments to 2025, I know from a certain level that certain commitments are being pushed all the way to 2030, is because we understand and appreciate the fact that you can't just have invested heavily into something and then quickly move out of it, and you need to recoup some of the investments you've made. So I think the critical thing we need to understand is that there is time, and that's why we're having this discussion now, not in 2025 when the industry will have said we are no longer accepting eggs, so that we have some window to start saying, what do I need to do as a farmer to move away from cage production system into a better production system that then keeps me in the market that I am in. And I think I must appreciate my friends in Kafur who have already started engaging their suppliers and saying, let's make the commitment now, but start working on a process of transitioning. And if you look at the slides, we also talked about certain places like Kafur in France is at 72% of the production is coming from cage-free system. That's what we need to then have those milestones. We start with maybe 10%, then to 50%, then 100%. And it's something that we need to do as an industry, not as individual farmers. In terms of the last question, holistic animal welfare, I do agree. And animal welfare is wide. And if you look at what the slide I talked about, the 7 farm animal welfare things that we are looking at, one of it was transportation, because we recognize the fact that farmers sometimes do very good production, but the transportation of that pig or that cow or that milk to the industry, to the market, then brings challenges. And I think that's something that we need to continue having discussion with. I know there is work being done. I alluded to the fact that we're already looking at the legal aspects. Maybe our laws are not where they need to be. And so there's revision of the laws to ensure that people are aware that there's a law that does that. For instance, if you look at the Kenyan context, the law that governs animal welfare was done in the early 60s. It has been revised severally, but now it's time to do a proper law that meets the current, addresses the current issues. And that is something that is critical and important. Thank you. Back to you, Beth.
All right. Thank you, Victor. We have had quite a number of questions coming in. We'll not be able to answer them in this session because of time constraints, but the ones that we have addressed are generally what most of you have asked around. So thank you very much for joining this webinar. After this, we'll have the journalist session. So if you're a journalist representing any media house, please stick around so that you get a chance to verbally ask Victor any questions for your stories later in the day. But before we close this completely, we'd like to put up a poll just to understand how your experience was with this webinar, because we endeavor to make it always better the next time you join us. Otherwise, thank you so much for starting the year with us, and we wish you a great rest of the week. We are officially now in the journalist session. If you are representing any media house, kindly raise your hand so that you have an opportunity to verbally ask your questions to Victor. We have about the next 15 minutes, so we'd like to do this a little bit fast, but all efficiently. Okay, we'll go to Nanjinia. You seem to be ready to speak.
Hello, Beth.
Hello, hi.
Hello. I want to ask Daktari, if today I picked an egg produced in a battery system, would it be a whole egg with all the nutrients or not?
All right, thank you for that. We'll take another one from Festus.
I was asking, most of the farmers are taking this system as a part of smart farming. So as we know right now, the agriculture has been devolved. What is your advice to the county government so that they implement the issue of educating farmers on the new ways that you have told us today?
Mercy, please unmute to be able to ask your question. All right, looks like she's not ready. Maybe we can take those questions as we let everyone else get ready.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. I'll take the two questions. I think the first one was from Nanjalia, or I hope I'm pronouncing the name properly, who asked whether if you took an egg from a battery cage system, it would have all nutrients. The answer is yes. And I think the discussion here is not whether the egg is nutritious or not. The discussion here is the impact of the production system on the welfare of the animal. And essentially what we are saying, and that's what the consumers are saying, that they no longer want production that is making the animal suffer. We have also shown that that production system is detrimental to the animal, because being put in that cage, if you stayed in that cage for the number of days that animal stays in that cage, which is barely the size of a microwave oven with 3 birds in it, you could see the stress the animal is going through. Because of that stress, you end up with certain processes. I've alluded to one, the disease processes that end up in that production system that then ultimately leads to overuse of antibiotics. So Najalia, it's not just that we are talking about the nutrient. We're also talking about the bigger thing. Is that production system sustainable? Are your customers going to enjoy looking at it? Is it something that the world wants? And I think that is why the world is moving away from that production system and has begun to say that by this and this dates, we will not be accepting production from that production system. If we maintain that the egg is still nutritious, the challenge we will be having in 5 or 10 years down the line is that our production system will not be meeting international standards, and the international markets that will be within our countries will be looking for other alternative sources of production that meet their standards. Because as I said earlier on, if Carrefour, for instance, using Carrefour as a global standard that says that they buy from eggs that are coming from non-cage production system, and they're pushing it in Thailand, they're pushing it in Brazil, they're pushing it in Europe, they're pushing it in France, and now they're pushing it in Africa, we have no otherwise that to conform to that standard. And I think that's what we need to be looking at. It's not about, I don't think at any one point we were discussing whether the egg is nutritious or not. But if you want to go down that challenge, there's also, if you look at literature, eggs from battery cage system have slightly less nutritious content, especially things around omega and vitamin D, because the bird then is not able to get some sunlight onto itself. And that's another totally different webinar that we can pick at another time. But if you are interested, we can share literature around the differences in nutritive quality of the egg from a battery cage system and eggs from free-range systems, and nutritionists can do that. In terms of Festus, smart farming and agriculture, I think Festus, what we need to recognize is that this is not a new technology. Traditionally, from where you and I come from, our birds used to run around and we collected eggs and defended themselves, which is close to what we were calling the free-range organic production system. We are now moving to battery cage system because of demand. There are more people want eggs, so we must produce more, and that's what we need to be worried about. Extension services is true, is something that is county-led. And I think as World Animal Protection, we are engaging counties and we are engaging countries to then look at some of these things and the messaging. And it's something that we're willing to work around. Thank you.
All right, Victor, thank you for that. There are some questions that have been asked in the chat box. For example, if the journalists would like to get data on the penetration of battery cage farming in Africa, or specifically in certain African countries, where can they be able to get that? Then the other one is, what is the role of just the regular day-to-day person who may know a farmer who is practicing battery cage farming? How can they advise them on the right thing to do? And then apart from that, we have Nuru Sadun who'd like to ask a question. Nuru, please go.
Hello, Victor. My question is, okay, I have three, but I'll just ask as one. Some eggs are produced using chemicals, and how are they healthy to humans? And if you come along, some eggs have 2 yolks. How is that? And then these vendors on the streets, let's say in Nairobi town, Kampala, everywhere, I hear they use chemicals to boil the eggs. And how safe is it? Thank you.
Thank you, Beth and Nuru. I think I will take those ones.
Yeah, maybe we can find out where Nuru is asking her question from, which media house. And
From Science Africa, Nairobi.
Okay, thank you so much. And for the other journalists, please write for us in the chat box which media house you and country you are from. Over to you, Victor.
Thank you, Beth. The first question about data of penetration of battery cage system farming in Africa, I think I would say it is country by country, because there are relevant people in each country who should be giving you that data. If you look at the Kenya, for instance, data can be obtained from Kenya, the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock, Fisheries. I think now they also include cooperatives in that ministry. Alternatively, there are organizations that have done research around some of these things, which we can share with you. I think last year, one of the organizations working in Kenya did a survey on the penetration of battery cage system. And I think that is the data that is readily available that we can share with you if you wanted that. So it's country by country. I think some data can also be obtained from people like FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization. I think they usually track how many eggs and what is happening where. So there are possibilities of where to look data. What is the role of the general public? I think the important thing is to start appreciating. And you remember when we started off, I talked about my disappointment that almost 70% of us didn't know where our food comes from. For me, that's the important thing. We start asking the relevant questions and then interrogating the production system so that we then appreciate what is being done and the impact of that production system onto the animal itself, and ultimately, as I said, food safety, food security, and livelihoods for the farmer for that matter. So there's various levels of engagement. And what I'd encourage those of us who are participating in this webinar today, follow us. I'm sure Beth will give you our contacts online, social media. Follow us. If there are any questions, ask. Then we'll be able to engage as we go forward. For Nuru's questions, I think the easiest one for me to answer is how an egg would end up with 2 yolks. Essentially, what happens is that for some strange reasons, there could be delay in the egg formation in the oviduct or the egg forming machine in that bird. And so what happens is 2 yolks are created, and by the time the egg is being encapsulated with the eggshell, it then encapsulates 2 eggs. And that tends to happen in high producers, and something that happens and it can be seen. I know the next question that comes around that is whether that egg would then produce twins. Unfortunately, that can't happen. So those eggs tend to end up being given out to be consumed. Eggs produced using chemicals is something that we've heard about. It's something that we'd like to have more information about, which chemicals, because my understanding is that there has been attempts to produce other products artificially, not only eggs. We have tried to produce meat artificially, milk artificially, and I think it's a discussion that is going on elsewhere that we also need to put our fingers on. What is happening because of population growth and diminishing land masses? How are we going to produce food in 10, 15, 20 years to ensure that it's sustainable? So there are processes and there's research going on how we can produce some of these things artificially. The question is whether there are regulations and the law caters for that and manages that so that people are not becoming unscrupulous in what they are doing. Use of chemicals to boil eggs and safety, I think it's a question of which chemical and why is it being used to boil that egg. And I think, again, that's a food safety issue that can be addressed by the various safety standards that come from the Bureau of Standards that are in the various countries. And I think, again, it's something that if you want more information, we can be able to engage on. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Victor. We do not have any further questions in the box, and neither do we have people raising their hand. Oh, I can see there's Lawrence. Lawrence, please go ahead and ask your question.
I'm asking, in African countries, most of the farmers who produce these things are compromised in the terms of production. So how can you be certain that the eggs you are consuming are coming from clean and safe environment? And my last question is, after attending such meetings, I advocate for a certificate for the sake of us who are students that may help us in pursuing an extension course that may help us outside there when it comes to job seeking and talking to farmers about this egg production system. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Lawrence. Eric Adusei, please unmute and ask your question. Eric? Yes, we can hear you. Please ask your question. Yes.
I would like to know the critical role the media can play in this issue and how, where can they get materials to build their capacity apart from webinars like this platform.
All right, thank you, Eric. You said you're from which media house in Ghana?
The Tribune.
All right. Maybe you can write for us in the chat. Is that okay?
Okay.
Thank you. All right, over to you, Victor.
Thank you, Beth, Lawrence, and Eric. I will try and address your questions. The first one Lawrence has asked is how do you, it's a statement that our farmers are compromised, hence, how do you know whether you are getting anything clean or safe from that production system? Essentially, Lawrence, what happens is that the poultry industry or the food industry has vigorous audits. Yeah, and that's why I was saying it is important for the consumer to understand where they're buying their food from. I know from working with industry that the big international brands or the big supermarkets in most of our countries have an audit where they go to the supplier, they audit the supplier, they go even onto the farm to look at the farm. The whole production system, is the farm meeting good biosecurity standards? Does it have good disease control standards? Is the environment clean? Are the animals fed with appropriate food? They even, some of the audits go as far as finding out where the feed came from, what ingredients went into that feed. So there's a whole audit system that good food systems go through. That is part of traceability, so that you ensure that whatever comes to your table, we know where it's coming from, the kind of processes that has been used to get it there. And that's why we keep encouraging consumers to ask those questions, because you need to start auditing where your outlet, if it's a supermarket, if it's a butchery, if it's your local kiosk, if they're bringing you eggs, are those eggs coming from the local farm? Are they being imported from somewhere else? And what process, how are they being carried? How are they being delivered? Are they being stored in the appropriate storage facilities, etc., etc.? So Lawrence, for that question, there are audit standards and the audit processes that one undergoes. Unfortunately, I didn't get your second bit of the question. Maybe Beth will give it to me. And then Eric, your question is one of the reasons why we then engage media. Because media, and if you saw the presentation, I talked about food scandals. Media is good at sensationalizing some of these things and giving statements that are not helping. If you say food from something is not safe, you have then given a statement, but then you've not given advice on what the farmer or the consumer or the general public should do. So part of our engagement with the media is to train media so that when you do your investigative stories or when you do your stories, it's not just about one side of the coin, but then saying, these are the things then we need to look at. For instance, today, you should be able to go back and write an article, and I think we will be giving you a press release that talks about the various aspects of what we've been talking about. That is something that you need to broadcast to your networks so that it raises awareness, so that farmers or consumers start understanding that this is where the world is going to, these are the practices that are happening, these are the likely consequences of some of these practices. It's also an opportunity for media to engage the policymakers and say, okay, we have now learned that cage-free, the world is moving towards cage-free production by 2025 at certain levels or 2030. What are we doing? Because I think for far too long, we have left our political class to look at other things and not look at critical things as food production. And we need to challenge them, and we need to get them to do the right policies, to create the right environment, the conducive environment where this poultry business can thrive. Otherwise, we might not be able to feed ourselves, or we might not be able to supply the big, the outlets that are around us with the product that they're looking for. Thank you. Over to you, Beth.
All right, thank you very much, Victor. We do not have any further questions, and this will be a good point to end. Should you think of something that you'd like to ask, please write to our media coordinator, Evans. We are just going to project his email right now. So you can write to Evans, Kipkorir at worldanimalprotection.org. Ask him any media related questions. He will book your radio interviews, your TV interviews, and even article interviews. So kindly reach out to him. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining our inaugural webinar for the year. We appreciate your attendance and support thus far, and we hope you will be good ambassadors of animal welfare out there. Do have yourselves a lovely rest of the week, and hopefully hope to see you in the next webinar. Take care. Bye.